Chapter 19. The next day, restless and energized, I thought about my next move while I puttered around my apartment. As much as I love handyman work, that's how much I hate housework. But sometimes you have to bite the bullet. Books, bills, and clothes accumulate in odd and inconvenient places, and eventually they have to be put neatly away so they can get messed up again. I put on a Dave Grusin CD and went to work. I picked up a few errant items of clothing and made a stack of unsorted and unfiled mail, bills, and miscellaneous papers to deal with last. Then, dusting, I let my mind kick the Penworth situation around. Whatever circumstances had gotten Alex killed were swirling around Tempo, at least, and possibly Hentai and the other Melfi Brothers restaurants. What I couldn't figure out was an angle of attack. I couldn't blunder around at the restaurants asking questions. There wasn't any reason for anyone to talk to me. I couldn't go to the cops. They'd just tell me to get lost again. And as far as I knew, they were part of the problem. They had their own thing going on, and they didn't want me messing up whatever it was. I didn't care what angle they were working. I just wanted the truth about Alex's death. But the simple quest for truth doesn't appeal to anyone unless there's a dividend in it for them. Until I knew what the cops were working on, I couldn't figure out how to produce anything that might be of value to them. I finished dusting. Then, on the theory that knowledge is power, or the truth shall set you free, I held off on the vacuuming to surf the internet for some background information on the Melfi brothers. Google didn't turn up anything interesting, so I splurged on a LexisNexis search. LexisNexis is a legal and periodical database that can handle long-string Boolean searches, and it has a lot of material that's not posted for free because of licensing fees. That's the kicker, because that makes it pretty expensive. It's used mostly by law firms, financial institutions, news organizations, and the like that need information fast. And for the most part, they can pass the high price on to clients. LexisNexis can handle really complicated Boolean string searches that target and narrow your search results. But the search I needed to do was pretty simple. I accessed the database and typed in the following: Melfi and restaurant and tempo or hentai or agave or pentimento. Putting the names of the restaurants in parentheses would call up articles that had both Melfi and restaurant and the name of any one of the other four restaurants. I got back 72 hits, mostly from the New York newspapers, along with a few from some business magazines. I scanned them, but didn't learn anything I didn't already know except some history. The brothers came from Lindenhurst, Long Island, the product of a solid lower-middle-class background. Their father was a plumbing contractor who had built a sizable business from the ground up. Their mother was a homemaker, active in the local church. The brothers started out with some smaller restaurants/nightclubs on Long Island. They had taken 3 unattractive cinder block dives, all of which had gone into bankruptcy under previous owners, remodeled the sites themselves, and brought in local bands that may or may not have been on the way up. Somehow, these out-of-the-way joints had turned into the happeningest Saturday night hotspots on the South Shore. Riding high on that success for a couple of fast-paced years, they had managed to bankroll their way into the New York City market. Still avoiding the vacuum cleaner, I went after another source of information. Most Fordham graduates stick around the city. They can be found in all branches of the legal profession, and it makes for a tremendous network. Since the legal profession is a necessary evil to every other business and endeavor, there are lawyers who know about and deal with people in all walks of life, from stock traders and real estate tycoons to hot dog vendors and homeless shelters. They all need lawyers. This network extends beyond your own classmates, and it's perfectly acceptable to call someone who went to the business school or the School of Social Services, tell them you're a Fordham grad, and then see what they can do for you. It's a vast spider web of information and gossip that stretches over the entire city. And at the very center of that spider web is my very good friend, Nick Kalachi. Nick is the guy who never has the answer, but he always knows someone who does. He has this talent partly because of his job and partly because of his personality. In real life, Nick is the Assistant United States Trustee for the Southern District of New York. This means that he's a Fed. When a business files for bankruptcy, Nick takes it over and protects any interest the federal government and private creditors might have. This can mean meeting with the principals and accountants of the business to shepherd them through reorganization of their assets and liabilities in such a way that the business can survive and still, to some extent, satisfy its obligations. Or it can mean that Nick has to show up at a warehouse at 3 o'clock in the morning with armed federal marshals to padlock the warehouse full of flat-screen televisions before they make their way to Bolivia at 4 o'clock in the morning via Airborne Express. That was one way to describe Nick. I preferred to think of Nick as the guy in the joke about the guy who knew everybody. It goes like this. Nick Kalachi was the guy who knew everyone. One day, his friend Zach called him on it. Nick, said Zach, you don't really know everyone. Yes, I do, said Nick. No, you don't, said Zach. Said Zach. It's just not possible. It might not be possible, but I do, said Nick. I do know everyone. I'll bet you, said Zach. I'll bet you don't know everyone. I don't want to take your money, said Nick. You're not going to. You're not going to take my money. I bet you. I bet you $50, said Zach. All right, said Nick. All right, said Zach. Let's see. You don't know Billy Crystal. I do, said Nick. Prove it, said Zach. Okay, this Saturday night, watch the Lakers game. The Lakers game, said Zach. The Lakers game, said Nick. So that Tuesday night, Zach sat at home alone and watched the Lakers game, which he really didn't like because he is not at all into sports unless it's the Olympics. But during the game, right at halftime, the announcers started checking out the celebrities who were there that night. As the camera panned the stands, there was Nick Kalachi. And who was sitting right next to him, sharing a big bag of popcorn and looking for all the world like he was laughing at one of Nick's jokes? None other than Billy Crystal. So the next day, Zach took another shot. You don't know Frank Sinatra, Zach said. This was in the days when old Blue Eyes was still with us. I do, said Nick. I do, as a matter of fact, know Frank Sinatra. Prove it, said Zach. Okay, said Nick. Be at the Raw Bar at the Clambroth House in Hoboken at 8 o'clock next Saturday night. This was also in the days when the Clambroth House was still with us. So Zach showed up at the Clambroth House in Hoboken, and this time he brought a date with him. He didn't want to lose a good opportunity to impress, just in case Nick really did know Frank Sinatra. Lo and behold, at 8:15, Frank Sinatra and Nick Kalachi walked through the door. Frank's got his arm draped over Nick's shoulders, and they're followed by a couple of guys with bent noses who look vaguely familiar in that oblique kind of way that you wouldn't want to mention. As they pass Zach and his date, Nick says, Francis, hold up a sec. I want to introduce you to my very good friend, Zach. Introductions are made all around, except for the guys with the bent noses who just give everyone the hard stare. Then the whole crew heads back into the dining room, leaving Zach speechless, thereby blowing his opportunity to impress his date. The next day, Zach knows he's got Nick dead to rights. He's got the all-time zinger. You don't know the Pope, Zach says. Nick just sighs. You don't, says Zach. You don't know the Pope. Okay, says Nick. Here it is. Be in St. Peter's Square next Sunday morning. Next Sunday morning? Yes. That's Easter. Next Sunday is Easter Sunday. Just be there. And so he is. Next Sunday morning finds Zach crammed into the square in front of St. Peter's Basilica, along with a teeming, seething mass of reverent, hopeful humanity, awaiting the blessing of the Holy and Supreme Pontiff. The tension builds, and then a hush falls as the great doors open on the balcony above the crowd, and the Pope steps out with Nick Kalachi at his side. Time stops for Zach. Space bends. Nothing is as it seems. And then, in a flash of inspiration, of brilliance, a brainstorm descends on Zach. He's the only Jew in the place, and yet he knows that God is smiling on him. He turns to the little old man next to him in the jam-packed sardine can that is St. Peter's Square on Easter morning. Excuse me, he says to the little old man. Excuse me, but do you know that man on the balcony? The old man turns to him and in heavily accented English says, Perdone, signore, I am sorry. I do not know who the man in the funny hat is, but the other man is my friend, Nick Kalachi. I picked up the phone and called Nick. I gave my name to his secretary, and when he picked up, he said, What do you need? You know, Keneally said the same thing when I got in touch with him last week. My feelings are hurt. I'm sobbing. So what do you need? Okay, I said, I'm into a thing, and I don't know what it is. I filled him in briefly on the Penworth scenario. The thing is, I said, I need to get a handle on what these guys might be up to that could attract the interest of the cops. I've got nothing, and I'm looking for anything. Where did you say they started out? Lindenhurst, I said. I'll fax you an article from Crane's. I don't need it, said Nick. I got a guy out on the island, restaurant supply and liquor wholesale, very plugged into the South Shore. I saved his ass last year, so he owes me. If these guys had hot spots, he knows them. I can also check with a friend with the Suffolk County DAs, see if these boys ever came to their attention. I'll get back to you. Shouldn't take more than a couple of days. I'll take you to Forlini's. You got it, said Nick, and rang off. I felt like I had set something in motion, so I resigned myself to running the vacuum. It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. It never is. The Dyson is a great machine, and its hum induced a trance-like alpha state. When I was done, the raised nap of the carpet reminded me of the back and forth rows of a newly mown lawn. I could almost smell the fresh-cut grass, and I was filled with a sense of accomplishment. I sat down at my desk to attack my piles of papers. The bills I put into the to-be-paid drawer on my large roll top. Catalogs I sorted, some to recycling, some to the magazine rack I had built into the bathroom after knocking out the old-fashioned in-the-wall metal laundry hamper. The junk mail I perused and threw away, or if it was an offer that contained an application for any kind of credit, I fed it into the shredder. Halfway through the stack, I came upon a Verizon bill and stopped, confused. I had just filed mine. Then I realized that it was the one from Cynthia's apartment. I tapped it on the desk and tried to decide whether or not to commit a federal offense. Then I realized it wasn't addressed to Cynthia. It was addressed to Alex. The phone must have been in his name only. Curiosity got the better of me. Who was to know? I opened the bill and spread the sheets on my desk. There weren't a lot of long-distance calls. There was one isolated call to 206, which turned out to be Seattle. The rest were grouped around two areas, 3 calls to Chicago and environs, and 12 other numbers that were all in the 914 and 845 area codes, sprinkled around Westchester and Putnam counties, both of which are just north of New York City. That struck me as pretty weird. That's where Alex's family was from. And as far as anyone knew, they weren't talking to each other. 3 of the numbers had only been called once. The other 9 had been called several times. I realized that to really check up on his phone activities, I was going to have to compare this bill to the rest of them. Luckily, I had taken all of Alex's old bills and bank records from the filing cabinet he shared with Cynthia, so I'd have everything I might need to help Cynthia switch utilities and the like to her name. I looked at the pattern of phone calls in the bill I had. Except for one, all of the 914 and 845 numbers were called within the space of 3 days. The Seattle call was in that time period as well. The first 914 call was isolated, 3 days before the cluster. Many of the calls in the cluster had been short, probably calls when Alex had gotten through to an answering machine. Then there were several calls that were longer, between 21 and 47 minutes, with one lasting almost an hour and a half. I pulled up a reverse directory site on Google and started plugging in phone numbers so I could get a list of the people he'd called. Most people don't know that this information is readily and easily accessible to anyone with internet access, along with tons of other information that's out there on just about anybody. Alumni records, newsletters, newspaper articles, annual reports, church bulletins, and a plethora of other items get published onto the web by virtually every business, organization, club, sorority, groups of almost every kind. It's now possible to get at least some information about almost anyone, all of it public, most of it free or cheap. This scares the crap out of a lot of people, and maybe they're right. I've never been too scared of it, but then I don't have that much to hide. I guess there are opposing views about the loss of privacy. I've always figured nobody would give a good goddamn about me, what I was up to. A friend of mine once told me that he'd had an argument with a coworker on this very subject. The coworker was complaining about the Easy Pass, the little device that lets you whiz through tolls without having to slow down to toss coins or hand bills to a human being. Instead, the charges end up on your credit card. The coworker said he would never get an Easy Pass. Then they know where I'm going, he said. My friend's response? First of all, he said, who are they? And secondly, if you don't want them to know where you're going, then I want to know where you're going. There was a time when those were my feelings on the matter as well. Nowadays, however, our post-9/11 government is doing its best to change my point of view. In the meantime, I figure the information is out there, it suits my purposes, and I'll use it to the best of my abilities. The first number, the one that was part of the cluster and had only been called once for 4 minutes, was for a Robert Sheehan in Ossining. Of the remaining 11 numbers, the reverse directory gave me names for 7, all women, and I Googled them. 3 of the names were too common and returned too many hits. Sarah Goldstein, 48,700. Nancy Campbell, 270,000. And Jane Thomas, 523,000. I decided to try Kelty Tenberg. There couldn't be too many of those around. I was right. Only a couple of hits, and they seemed to be for the same person. One of them was an article in the Journal News, a suburban paper, about the Little Footsteps preschool in Katona, a town in northern Westchester. Kelty Tenberg had opened it 3 years ago. It provided a holistic approach to child rearing in an environment that supported and encouraged vegetarian diets, alternative health therapies, i.e. homeopathy, and only positive sum games, role play, and creativity in the classroom. Since there couldn't be more than one Kelty Tenberg in Katona, New York, I knew I had found one of the right women. I looked at the photograph attached to the article. It showed an attractive woman in her mid-30s in jeans and a denim shirt. sitting on a floor wearing a smock, finger painting with three small children. I looked at the phone bill. Hers was the phone call that had lasted nearly an hour and a half. Next, I Googled Mary Caspian and Ellen Warmott. No hits came back for Warmott, and the few that came back for Caspian seemed unrelated. Last on the list was Gillian Tracy. A bunch of hits, but the one that popped out was the website for a cosmetic company that marketed to the health and holistic communities. The product line was upscale, very expensive, not tested on animals, and used only natural ingredients, leaning heavily on aromatherapy and essential oils type stuff. Posing on the homepage was an easily recognizable international supermodel who credited Earth Tones Cosmetics with much of her success. There was also a quote outlining the cosmetics philosophy attributed to Gillian Tracy, one of the company's founders and its current marketing director. This looked promising. I clicked on the Who We Are link and pulled up the photos and short bios of the three founders. Bingo. The second photograph was the woman from the memorial service. Proud of myself, I shook the contents out of the envelope of other bills I had taken from Cynthia and Alex's filing cabinet. I sorted them, putting them into chronological order. There were over 4 years' worth of phone bills in the pile, so they covered the time period from before Alex moved to New York. I went through them looking for any calls to the 914 or 845 area codes. It didn't take long, and I only found 3 phone calls to those area codes. None of those calls was within even a year of Alex's death. Clearly, they were far enough removed from the recent flurry of activity that I could discount them. But I ran all 3 numbers through the reverse directory just to be safe. Sure enough, I came up with numbers for a high school and a pediatrician's office, both in Alex's hometown, as well as an unlisted number he had called once 3 years ago. Sure, these older calls weren't connected with Alex's death. I decided to start where Alex had started and give Robert Sheehan a call. I dialed the number. The voice that picked up the phone after 2 rings stumbled in the middle of its first attempt at hello, and it took a moment to pick itself up off the ground and try again. When it did, it was soft and weary. "Is this Robert Sheehan?" There was a pause in which I could hear gentle breathing, and then, "Speaking." "Mr. Sheehan, my name is Zachary Brandis, and I'm calling with what may be disturbing news, but I'm not sure. Did you know Alex Penworth?" "Alex? Yes, I did. I saw him several weeks ago." Again, a pause in which I heard his breath. I waited. "Has something happened to him?" "I'm afraid he died, Mr. Sheehan. I hope that... Well, I guess I'm curious. Were you close? Did you know him well?" "Close? No. No, I wouldn't say we were close, but yes, I guess you could say I know him well. Knew him well, that is, several years ago." "And how did you know him, sir, if I may?" "Who did you say you were again?" "My name is Zachary Brandis. I'm investigating his death." I figured it was true. I was investigating. It's not like I was telling the guy I was a cop or anything. "I see. Well, I knew Alex several years ago. He was my daughter's boyfriend." "I see. And when was this, sir?" "He went out with her for 4 years right up until she died." I already knew this. "I'm so sorry," I said. "When was that, if I may ask?" 7 years ago." "And you've stayed in touch with him?" "No, I haven't. I mean, we didn't stay in touch, my wife and I. His voice was getting softer and softer as we spoke. But you spoke to him. You saw him recently? Yes. Yes, we saw each other. I thought now that Evie was gone that he should know. I'm sorry. He died, you say? Yes. Oh my. He was speaking very softly now, and I could barely hear him. Excuse me, but you thought that he should know what? I don't know. Maybe it was a mistake. I don't know. He sounded like he was crying now. It's all gone. It's all gone now. Sir, what was it that he should have known? I'm sorry, he whispered, and then he hung up. And that is the end of chapter 19. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and make sure you click on the bell icon so that you get notifications of upcoming live streams. And also head over to my website, matthewarkin.com, and sign up for my newsletter, which will give you interesting articles on the craft of writing and the craft of acting.